Blood sprayed across his weathered face as the red-bearded emperor raised his blade to the heavens, unleashing a war cry that split the morning air. Around him, the dust of Anatolia mixed with the iron smell of death. 10,000 exhausted crusaders who'd survived hell itself stood at his back. Before them, a fortress that had never fallen. Behind them, nothing but bones and broken dreams scattered across 1,000 miles. And closing in from the east, 40,000 fresh Turkish warriors hungry for Christian blood. Every military manual said they should already be dead. Yet within the next 24 hours, the impossible would happen, and the killing fields of Iconium would run red with the blood of an empire. To understand how one aging warrior turned certain annihilation into history's most brutal slaughter, we need to rewind 3 weeks, to a decision that would echo through eternity. But first, was Sultan Kilij Arslan's arrogance justified? Here was a man who dominated Anatolia for 2 decades, watching crusader armies melt away in the desert sun. He lost because he couldn't imagine starving. Desperate men would attack instead of defend. His fatal flaw, assuming his enemy would follow the rules. Sound familiar? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and if you think overconfidence is arrogance or just bad luck. And if you believe audacity can still change the world, hit that like button and subscribe. Because we've got more stories of underdogs who rewrote history by breaking every rule. Now let me transport you to the scorching plains of Anatolia, where death was approaching from every direction. May 1190, the Third Crusade, history's greatest military alliance, was underway. While Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus chose the safe sea route, one man made a different choice. A choice born of pride, ambition, and the refusal to bow to age. Frederick Barbarossa, the Redbeard. At 68 years old, Europe's most feared warrior emperor had nothing left to prove. 4 decades of warfare had made him a living legend, a mountain of a man in bloodied chainmail, his iconic red cape billowing behind him like a banner of war. He'd broken armies, toppled kingdoms, and made emperors kneel. Yet here he was leading 100,000 men, the largest crusader army ever assembled, straight into the heart of enemy territory. Not around it. Not avoiding it, through it. Why? Because Barbarossa didn't believe in easy paths. His opponent was Sultan Kilij Arslan II, the Lion's Sword, master of the Turkish way of war. For 2 decades, he'd ruled the Seljuk Sultanate with an iron fist, controlling Anatolia like a spider in its web. His cavalry archers had perfected mobile warfare, striking like lightning from the desert wind, then melting away like smoke before the Crusaders could respond. No Western army had successfully crossed his territory in living memory. Those who tried left their bones bleaching in the Anatolian sun, but Barbarossa saw something others missed. The Turks were predictable, overconfident. They fought the same way their grandfathers had, relying on speed and arrows while avoiding close combat. They couldn't conceive that an army of ironclad knights could endure their harassment long enough to threaten them. That arrogance would cost them everything. Because in 3 weeks' time, on a blood-soaked day in May, the old emperor would teach the Islamic world a lesson they'd never forget. That the Iron Men of the West weren't just dangerous when fresh and well-fed. They were most dangerous when you thought they were already dead. But first, Barbarossa would have to march his army through hell itself. The decision was made in the spring of 1190, as Europe's greatest military alliance assembled for the Third Crusade. Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus, young and pragmatic, chose the proven sea route, comfortable galleys, reliable supply lines, minimal risk. But Frederick Barbarossa wasn't interested in comfort. At 68, with nothing left to prove and everything to win, he chose the land route straight through the heart of Turkish territory. It was pride, yes. Ambition, certainly. But it was also calculation. The old emperor wanted to show Europe and himself that German steel could go where others feared to tread. He stood before 100,000 men that spring morning, the largest crusader army ever assembled. Knights in gleaming armor, infantry with crosses stitched on their tunics, siege engineers, supply wagons stretching to the horizon. They cheered their legendary emperor, the Redbeard who'd never lost a campaign. None of them knew they were marching toward annihilation. The nightmare began within days. The Anatolian sun was merciless, 95 degrees daily, turning 250 pounds of armor and chainmail into mobile ovens. Men collapsed from heat stroke before the enemy even appeared, but the Turks were watching. Sultan Kilij Arslan. I's cavalry archers struck on the third day, a black cloud of arrows from nowhere, then gone before the crusaders could respond. It was a preview of the horror to come. The bleeding started immediately. Disease ripped through the camps. Dysentery, typhus, plague, men who'd survived battles across Europe died shaking in their tents. Week 1, 100,000 became 80,000. The Turks poisoned wells ahead of the march, forcing crusaders to drink from stagnant pools. Ambushes became daily occurrences. Week 2, 80,000 became 50,000. Supplies burned mysteriously in the night. Horses died by the hundreds. Starvation set in. Week 3. 50,000 became 30,000, then 20,000, then barely 15,000. The largest crusader army in history was melting away like morning mist. The psychological warfare was worse than the arrows. Turkish riders circled just beyond crossbow range, shouting taunts in a dozen languages. They waved captured Christian banners like trophies. They described in vivid detail the torture awaiting prisoners: impalement, flaying, crucifixion. Night raids prevented sleep. Men started breaking. The Duke of Swabia begged his father to retreat to friendlier territory. The Bishop of Wurzburg prayed for divine intervention, seeing none. Count Robert of Nassau did the mathematics and concluded their chances of survival were zero. But Barbarossa wasn't panicking, he was studying. During every attack, between every skirmish, the old emperor watched how the Turks fought. They used the same tactics every time: harass from range, never close, rely on mobility and arrows. Predictable. Overconfident. They hadn't adapted to the evolution of Western warfare, to the devastating power of disciplined, heavy cavalry in concentrated formation. They believed their grandfathers' tactics would work forever. That arrogance was exploitable. Then the fortress appeared on the horizon, Iconium, the heart of Turkish power in Anatolia. Triple walls rose 30 feet from the dusty plains, 10 feet thick, studded with towers every 100 yards. Green banners bearing the crescent moon snapped in the wind. The gates could withstand any siege engine in existence. Behind those walls, 5,000 Turkish warriors waited with Greek fire and months of supplies. The city had never fallen, not once, not ever. Barbarossa counted his remaining force: 15,000 combat-effective troops. 2,000 knights still had warhorses, though many animals were skeletal shadows. 8,000 infantry, exhausted beyond measure but still disciplined. 5,000 men lost just reaching this point, left in shallow graves or no graves at all across 1,000 miles of hostile territory. Then the scouts brought news that turned blood to ice. The Sultan's main army was approaching from the east, 40,000 warriors, fresh, well-fed, eager for Christian blood. 20,000 elite cavalry archers, each man carrying 150 arrows and 2 bows. 15,000 infantry. 5,000 irregular Turkmen troops hungry for plunder and glory. They would arrive within 2 days. The mathematics were simple and devastating. 15,000 exhausted crusaders versus 5,000 in the fortress plus 40,000 approaching, trapped between hammer and anvil. Every military manual ever written said retreat or prepare defensive positions, accept defeat or die trying to minimize losses. But Sultan Kilij Arslan made a fatal error born of absolute confidence. He divided his forces, some defending Iconium, some shadowing the crusaders, his main army positioned to deliver the killing blow once the Christians exhausted themselves against the walls. Time was his ally, or so he believed. Let them break against the stone. Let starvation finish what arrows had started, then sweep in for the slaughter. What the lion's sword couldn't conceive, what no Turkish commander could imagine, was that these starving, desperate, dying crusaders might not defend at all. They might attack. On the evening of May 17th, Barbarossa summoned his commanders to the command tent. Duke Frederick VI of Swabia entered first, the emperor's own son, just 23, burning with youth's fire and desperate to prove himself. Count Robert of Nassau followed, a veteran of a dozen campaigns, his Rhineland troops among the most disciplined in the army. Finally, Markwald of Neuburg, commander of the 500-man Imperial Guard, men who'd sworn oaths to die before letting harm reach their emperor. These were the men who would execute the impossible. Barbarossa's plan was madness. He would divide their already inferior forces. His officers erupted in protest. This violated every principle of warfare. Outnumbered forces concentrate, they don't split. But the old emperor's logic was ruthless. Duke Frederick would take 3,000 men, including 700 knights, and assault Iconium directly. Barbarossa would keep 7,000 to face the Sultan's 40,000 in open battle. Each force was now outnumbered 5-1 or worse. It was suicide by mathematics. Unless you understood the psychology, the garrison would see a small force and sortie out to destroy it. Pride wouldn't let them cower. The Sultan's army would press close, sensing easy victory. Both would be exactly where Barbarossa wanted them. And hidden in his 7,000 was a weapon the Turks had never faced. 500 Imperial Guard knights on the last fresh horses in the army, full armor maintained despite the march, trained for years in the devastating iron wedge formation that could punch through any line like God's own battering ram. That night priests held mass throughout the camp. Knights confessed sins they'd carried for years, certain tomorrow would bring judgment. Infantry sharpened weapons one final time, wrote final letters they'd never send. But then Barbarossa himself appeared among the men, calm, confident, almost amused by the impossible odds. "Tomorrow," he said simply, "we remind them why their grandfathers feared the iron men of the West." Later in his tent he called his son. The tactical details were discussed quietly. What remained unspoken hung heavy between them. They both knew one or both might die at dawn. The embrace before Duke Frederick departed lasted longer than usual. May 18, 1190. Dawn broke blood-red over Anatolia. The columns separated in pre-dawn darkness. Duke Frederick's 3,000 advanced openly toward Iconium, no concealment, visible for miles. Turkish sentries watched in disbelief. Was this suicide? 700 knights and 2,300 infantry moved in perfect formation toward walls that had never fallen. Meanwhile, Barbarossa positioned his 7,000 on a slight rise 2 miles from the city. The deployment looked defensive, desperate, cavalry on the wings, infantry in center, exactly the formation a dying army would take. Turkish scouts reported what Barbarossa wanted them to see: exhausted Christians preparing for their last stand. The first arrows came at sunrise. Turkish cavalry archers swept forward in their traditional crescent, and the sky turned black. 10,000 arrows in the first wave alone. But the Crusaders didn't break. They'd endured 3 weeks of this hell, shields locked in practiced unison, overlapping protection, minimal losses. They knew the patterns now. Mid-morning, Iconium's commander made his fatal decision. 3,000 crusaders at his walls posed little direct threat, but pride wouldn't let him hide while Christians approached. The gates opened. 2,000 Turkish cavalry poured out, expecting fleeing opponents. Instead, they hit disciplined German infantry squares bristling with spears. Crossbowmen targeted horses with devastating effect. Duke Frederick's trap had sprung. His 700 heavy knights charged. The impact was catastrophic, armored destriers bowling over lighter Turkish mounts. lances punching through mail, swords rising and falling in mechanical rhythm. The garrison cavalry, caught between charging knights and infantry squares, was being systematically destroyed. The crusader infantry sprinted for the open gates. The race was on. At noon, the Sultan's 40,000 arrived in full strength. Drums thundered, war cries of Allahu Akbar echoed across the plains. Arrows continued raining 30,000 in 10 minutes. The crusader line bent. Men fell, but discipline held. Turkish cavalry pressed closer, sensing the kill. Sultan Kilij Arslan took position on a low hill, his green banner emblazoned with Quranic verses announcing his presence to all. Victory was minutes away. Then scouts brought news. Duke Frederick had engaged the garrison, the gates were open. The Sultan made his choice, ignore it. Finish Barbarossa first, 40,000 against 7,000. Swift victory was certain. Then came the single trumpet note that changed everything. The Crusader center opened like the gates of hell. 500 Imperial Guard knights emerged in perfect wedge formation, fresh warriors on powerful destriers, full armor gleaming despite weeks of travel. The formation was 50 yards wide at the base, narrowing to a point where a single knight carried a 30-pound lance. And at that tip, red cape streaming behind him, sword raised high, face contorted in a war cry that could be heard across the battlefield, rode Frederick Barbarossa himself. God wills it. The cry erupted from 2,000 throats as every mounted crusader joined the charge. Behind the Imperial Guard, 1,500 more knights formed a second wave. They built speed down the gentle slope Barbarossa had chosen weeks ago for exactly this moment. 300 yards covered in 40 seconds, 30 miles per hour, 2,000 tons of steel and fury. The sound was thunder mixed with earthquake. The ground shook. Turkish warriors who'd never fled battle felt their courage waver. Count Berthold of Neuenberg at the Wedge's point hit first. His lance shattered on impact, punching through 3 men. The Wedge followed, unstoppable momentum meeting flesh and bone. Turkish front ranks didn't stand a chance. Bodies flew. Bones snapped, blood fountained into the dusty air. The Sultan's elite Mamluk guards formed a spear wall, brave men, well-trained, refusing to flee. They held for exactly 7 seconds. Then the avalanche overwhelmed them. Spears snapped like twigs, bodies were trampled. The line disintegrated, and those 7 seconds of resistance only made the breakthrough more catastrophic. Barbarossa led the charge directly at the Sultan's standard. His Imperial Guard formed a steel fist around him. Red cape and green banner on collision course, a moment frozen in time before impact. The Sultan's personal guard fought desperately, but momentum was physics, and physics was unstoppable. The green silk banner fell, trampled under crusader hooves. Allah has abandoned us. The cry spread like wildfire. Turkish morale imploded. 1 unit fleeing became 10, became hundreds, became thousands. Elite troops who'd never retreated threw down weapons. The Sultan himself turned his horse east and galloped for safety, abandoning his army to save his own life. No quarter, no mercy. Barbarossa's order was clear. Fleeing enemies were ridden down like deer. Infantry methodically killed the wounded. This wasn't chivalry. This was extermination. The Crusaders had suffered too much to show mercy now. At 2 p.m. the jaws closed. Duke Frederick's forces burst from Iconium's eastern gates just as fleeing Turks from the field battle reached the city seeking safety. Caught between 2 Christian forces, the trap was complete. What followed wasn't battle but execution, systematic slaughter, swords rising and falling like harvest scythes. Bodies piled so high they formed barriers. Blood turned the dusty ground to mud. The numbers tell the story. 15,000 to 20,000 Turks dead in 6 hours. Crusader losses, fewer than 500. 30 to 40 Turks dead for every Christian, a disparity unheard of in medieval warfare. Inside Iconium, the city burned. Warehouses were systematically looted, grain, weapons, gold. The legendary treasury of rum, accumulated over generations, was emptied in hours. Men who'd been starving on routes now gorged on captured supplies. Wine cellars were drained. After weeks of misery, an explosion of primal celebration. Barbarossa, his armor blood-splattered from a dozen personal kills, found his son near the palace ruins. Both had survived impossible odds. The embrace amid carnage and smoke spoke what words couldn't. "You did well, my son," the emperor said simply. Witnesses reported tears on the old warrior's face, relief, pride, exhaustion mixing in that moment of victory. From the citadel, Sultan Kilij Arslan watched his capital burn, his army destroyed, his empire's reputation shattered. 20 years of dominance ended in 6 hours. At dawn on May 19th, he emerged under a flag of truce, offering anything: 100,000 gold pieces, 500 noble hostages, provisions, guides. Barbarossa accepted. His strategic goals were achieved. But then came the cruelest twist of fate. 22 days later, June 10, 1190, while crossing the Salef River in Armenia, Frederick Barbarossa drowned. The water was waist-deep. His horse slipped, or perhaps his armor's weight pulled him under. The man who'd survived 40 years of warfare died in a stream. His army, devastated by the loss, largely dissolved. Without Barbarossa, the Third Crusade never achieved decisive victory. Iconium stands as his final masterpiece, proof that disciplined heavy cavalry could overcome any odds, that psychological warfare mattered as much as steel, that leadership could transform exhausted men into world conquerors. The iron wedge formation he perfected became standard Western tactics. Military academies still study the battle. The ruins of Iconium remain in modern Turkey, where visitors walk where Barbarossa charged. But the true monument isn't stone. It's the lesson that when leadership, technology, and indomitable will unite, even impossible odds become merely difficult. In one blood-soaked afternoon, an aging emperor proved that courage and cunning can change the world, and that history belongs to those who dare greatly, whatever the cost.